If you're anyone who's browsed the StudyTube or productivity side of YouTube, and you're a student who's followed creators like Ali Abdal or Karma Medic, or even if you're watching this video, then chances are you've heard a lot of hype around a device called an iPad. A lot of students talk about using it, but how useful is it truly in helping you get the best grades possible and optimizing your learning and revision? Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Jack and I'm a student studying in London. And in this video, I'm going to talk about whether or not as a student you need an iPad in order to help you do the best you can in your studies and in your revision. As usual, timestamps will be in the description below so you can jump around and find exactly what you're looking for without wasting any time. In this video, I'll be discussing the pros and cons of having an iPad, and hopefully by the end of it you'll be able to make an informed decision about whether or not you feel it's right for you to make the leap and purchase one of these. Now, in favor of upfront conclusions, I will just tell you straight away that for most people you don't need an iPad. In fact, with most things related to education or studying, there's very few things that you can say definitively everyone needs in order to do well. Before the iPad was even a thing, there were students who were achieving amazing grades. So clearly you don't need an iPad. However, that's not to say that an iPad can't make you more efficient or make your workload more manageable and just overall make your life slightly easier. Personally, from my own experience, I feel like I can say with confidence that the iPad has definitely helped me in a lot of elements of my studies, and I feel that without it, it would have definitely been a lot harder to revise for some of my subjects and essentially do the best that I could. There are certain elements that the iPad definitely played a crucial role in my revision, and without it, those elements of my studies would definitely have taken a bit more effort and might not have been as easygoing or as efficient as it was. I'll definitely be going into more detail about this throughout the video and giving you reasons as to why you might want to consider an iPad and why you might want to consider not buying one. Now, just for some background about me and just my overall usage, I do just want to say that before I bought the iPad, I was definitely managing all my revision perfectly fine, and there wasn't really a moment where I thought I couldn't handle the workload and that I needed to buy an iPad. It was more so something that I felt could complement my workflow and make it more efficient and just save me a bit of time here and there. But I definitely wouldn't say that it revolutionized anything. Essentially, buying an iPad won't suddenly bump you up to becoming an A-star student. You'll still have to work, you'll still have to implement correct revision techniques and work hard towards it. In terms of how I used my iPad, it should just be known that I did not use my iPad to make any notes. In fact, throughout my A-levels, I didn't make any notes whatsoever. And just for me personally, I find that notes weren't that helpful. I personally used my iPad to do practice questions for the subjects that I was sitting. And I say this was definitely really important for me throughout A-level because there's such a huge emphasis on doing enough past paper questions. It should also be noted that I used the iPad for tutoring. I tutor in my spare time to earn a bit of money on the side, and I definitely feel like having the iPad with me is a huge help. I'm able to really conveniently annotate on my iPad and work through questions. Whoever I'm tutoring can see exactly what I'm doing, and it makes explanation just slightly more easier. So that's about it for how I use my iPad. Hopefully going into the video now you'll have a bit more insight into why I may hold the opinions that I hold and where the advice is coming from. Let's start off with the first pro, which is that, like I mentioned before, it makes it very convenient to do past paper practice questions and exam style questions. Before getting the iPad, I would always print out past paper questions so that I could answer them at home. I didn't have a printer at home, and so I'd just always do it at school because it was free. Now, this method worked, but there were a few issues with it. Firstly, after a few weeks it became a lot of hassle to manage all the sheets of paper, and eventually there were stacks upon stacks of just exam questions that I hadn't gone through on my desk mixed with the exam questions that I did go through, and it started to just get a little bit messy. And the reason I'd have to print out so many exam questions is that I'd need to make sure that I'd printed out enough that I'd be able to go through a bunch in the evening and not have to run out. Because obviously if I ran out, like I said, I didn't have a printer, and so it would be a really big hindrance in my workflow if I had to wait the next day to print out more questions. Now, yes, I could have just looked at the questions on my laptop and just maybe written it out on a spare piece of paper, but I definitely found that using the actual exam format and the exam style questions from the exam boards made the experience a lot more like the actual exams. However, with the iPad now, I don't have to be as organized. I don't have to make sure that I'm printing out questions ahead of time and making sure that I have enough questions, since if I want to do a question on a certain topic or a certain subject like biology or chemistry, then I can just go online, find the questions and bring it up. Managing my desk and keeping it clean was so much more easier, and I definitely believe that having a clean workspace and a good environment makes learning a lot more easier. So this was definitely a huge plus for me. The next point kind of follows on from the last point, and that's the fact that you save paper. Paper can be really expensive, and it can just overall be bad for the environment to waste too much paper. Having the iPad saves you the hassle of having to carry around a lot of paper or having to organize all these loose sheets of paper all over your desk. If you're also someone who likes to take notes, you also won't have to hassle yourself by carrying all your notebooks or folders. Instead, you can just carry the iPad in your bag, and most iPads are quite small. I think this one is about 10.5 inches, and I think the biggest one is 12.9 inches, which is more than small enough to fit into most bags. And I found that this was way more easier for me to transport to school and back than having to carry around a lot of folders. The third pro is that you save a lot of money on stationery. With iPads, you have all these apps that give you access to different pen types, different pen thicknesses, different colors, different pages, different sizes, all sorts of things that if you had to buy physically would definitely set you back quite a bit. And bear in mind that you'd only have a finite amount. For example, if you bought lined paper, then you'd eventually run out and you'd have to buy more, whereas with the iPad you just have an infinite amount and you never really run out of paper. Now, that's not to say that the iPad is by any means cheap, and I will get onto that a bit later on, but I think in the long run it can definitely be a lot more sustainable than having to buy all these stationery and all these papers. The fourth pro is a bit more niche to my situation, and that's the fact that having an iPad was so convenient for online lessons. And that's partially why I bought the iPad, because I felt that it would make online lessons a lot more easier and sorting out all my work, and I can definitely say with certainty that that was true. This was especially the case if the teachers gave worksheets, and trust me, our teachers gave us so many worksheets, so much work to do, and I found that instead of either printing it out, which was really difficult for me, or doing it on separate pieces of paper and taking a picture of each piece of paper and then uploading it one by one and making sure I didn't forget anything, instead I could just download the PDF onto my iPad, open it up into GoodNotes and just work through the worksheet and then easily just upload it as one PDF and just save myself so much hassle. Now, yes, you might save yourself only a few minutes per sheet, but over the course of the entire lockdown and every online lesson I had and every piece of work that I had to hand in, I definitely say that it saved me a significant amount of time, hassle and stress that essentially meant that I could focus more on my studies and revision. And that's about it for the pros. Now moving on to the cons, and the first and probably most obvious one is the cost of buying an iPad. There's definitely no escaping this, and I feel like the iPad is a bit of a luxury. It can be quite expensive, and even if you look at the cheapest baseline models, it can definitely cost a significant amount depending on whatever your situation is. For me, I went for a mid-tier iPad. I've got the iPad Air 3, but I know that a lot of people talk about how the baseline iPad is still equally as good and can get the job done. However, this is probably one of the key elements that are stopping a lot of students buying it, and so I just want to reassure you that if you do find it too expensive and you can't justify the purchases, you're not missing out too much. And I still know loads of students who didn't have an iPad or a tablet and they were able to do perfectly fine in all their studies. However, if you are on the fence, then definitely think about all the pros that I talked about, and maybe you can justify the purchase purchase if you feel that in the long run it will definitely save you a lot of time and energy. The second con is kind of following on from the first one, and that's the whole element of there being some hidden fees. The reality is that if you buy the iPad on its own, then chances are you're not really going to get much benefit out of it, especially if you're like me and you've already got a laptop that works perfectly fine. To really reap the benefits of an iPad, you do have to spend a bit of extra money on certain accessories. For example, with this iPad, I bought the Apple Pencil with it, and I definitely say that without this Apple Pencil, I definitely wouldn't be able to get as much use with the iPad. Another thing is that if you want a really good note-taking app, then most of them do cost money. If you're someone who's been doing some research into buying an iPad as a student, then you've probably heard of the popular ones like GoodNotes and Notability, and they do cost money, and so that is something to consider if you're buying an iPad. Now yes, relative to the iPad, those apps don't cost too much, but it's still something you should be wary of, and it is kind of like a hidden fee that you should know about before buying. The third con, and in my opinion a significantly major one, which is something you'll experience once you buy the iPad, is that it doesn't feel perfectly like you're writing on paper. Now yes, you can get certain screen protectors like Paperlike, which I personally haven't used because I think they're just extortionately priced and just not very affordable, but I do have a matte screen protector on this iPad that provides some friction, but even then I would argue that it doesn't perfectly imitate the feeling of writing on rough paper and just the friction you feel when you are writing on it. I think this is especially important to know if you're someone who does essay-based subjects where you're writing on paper quite a bit. I remember when we first came back from the lockdown and doing online lessons, I was doing all my psychology essays by hand on my iPad, but then when it came to doing them in class on paper, I definitely felt more strain on my hand that I'd kind of become unaccustomed to because I'd been writing on the iPad so much. Now there are easy ways to counteract that. For example, you can just make sure that you're integrating in your revision points where you're writing on paper and you're doing essays on paper, but it is something to be wary of, and I feel like when I got the iPad, it wasn't something that I'd heard too much about. Most of these YouTubers were promoting Paperlike, but the reality was that for me as a student, it didn't really feel like a worthwhile purchase, especially since there was a lot of mixed reviews and it's sometimes hard to take advice from videos that are sponsored, and so I was on the fence about buying it and I decided not to. And with that, we have reached the end of the video. So if you found the video useful, you enjoyed it, then leave a like, subscribe, and do let me know what you thought about it or if you have any questions. Bear in mind, I've used this iPad for over a year now, and so if you have any specific questions about my experience with it or any particular thing you're concerned about before buying it, then ask below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. That's been all from me, and goodbye.